Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, we're continuing this discussion that we started last Monday on the backlog of questions that we have from our listeners on things that were important to them. They reached out, and we are kind of going through that list and kind of airing it all out and answering the questions as best as we can. We typically do this throughout the year and answer questions that listeners send in if they are questions about a person's personal experience or something they need advice on right now. These are more questions that are not related to an individual person, but more related to what is leadership going to be looking like, or what is important to these particular listeners from a leadership standpoint. And we started it last Monday. We're continuing it this Monday, and it'll go for about a total of 5 episodes. The first question I want to answer from our listeners is, how can leaders build high-performing teams when it seems like there's constant talent shortages and skill gaps? And I thought that was an interesting one, because I know organizations who it seems like they are always trying to deal with a talent shortage or a skill gap. And I know other organizations in the same industry that don't seem to suffer from it or don't seem to have those impacted as much. So there's got to be differences in what they're doing, but they may not always be clear looking in from the outside.
Yeah, I think it's a great kind of topic in question, because it's such an important thing that's happening right now around the speed of which we're seeing in different industries and different places with technology, with AI, with whatever, is causing this kind of new and very quick moving approach to how we're getting work done. And with that comes the possibility that you're going to get some skill gaps. There'll be things that your people in the teams are not, they maybe they don't know today, or they're learning kind of as things are coming out. And we're seeing this across all different industries. And so the ability of the leader to peek around the corner, to see what's going on, to be able to predict to a degree where things are going. What are you seeing in your industry from the organizations and the idea makers that are kind of on the razor's edge of it, the ones that are really pushing a different approach, a different take. They're utilizing new technologies. They're kind of like, just shaking up the norms. If you're not aware of that and watching that, and then thinking about, if we go down this way or if we go down this route, how can I best prepare my team for that? That's where I think you start to see this massive skill gap continue to grow over time. And that is definitely a part of leadership, because even if you're not necessarily in the same role that you have today in 2 years or 5 years, if you're in that same industry, if you're doing that same level of work, if you're elevating yourself in your own career, you're going to have larger responsibilities. You're going to have larger influences on the decisions that are being made down the road here. So if you can get ahead of it now and think about how are you making sure that you're building skill with your team, and that you're building the talent that you need, while also being aware of what talent is out there. If you're not doing that, you're going to find yourself in a really tough spot, being behind and not having an attractable offer or value proposition to bring people to your team or your organization.
Right. I look at companies when it comes to this, and they kind of fall in 3 different categories. And you don't necessarily have to be in the top category, but you really can't be in the bottom category. Okay, and there are companies who are creating this. They're the ones who are driving what skills are going to be needed in the future. They're the companies that they have first grabs at who that talent is, because they're the ones creating the things that need that talent to begin with. And so it is what it is. There's not much you can do to be in that group if your role in your industry is not one that creates those things. But then there's the back group, the one leading up the rear, where they don't even know what those skills are. They don't even know what those trends are. And so all the decisions they are making with regard to talent and hiring and recruiting and lessening skill gaps are all done from a reactive standpoint. Let's address a skill gap that's already there. Let's address a talent shortage that's already there. We're not doing well here. We need to hire some people who can have these skills. It's like, if that's the way you go about this, you're going to be fighting a losing battle that will become harder and harder to play as time goes on. The sweet spot for a lot of organizations and a lot of teams is the middle ground, which is, that you're not defining where things are going. You know that you don't have a lot of influence on what skills will be needed from a technological standpoint or an industry standpoint, but you know enough about the industry and you know enough about who those top players are and what they're doing, and you kind of keep abreast of what they're doing to the point where when you see something coming, you can start reacting to it immediately. You can start reaching out and hiring for those skills, looking for the talent in places where other people aren't necessarily looking yet because they don't have that skill necessarily on their radar yet. That's the place that a lot of organizations should be at, because that's how you get talent before it becomes such in short supply that you end up with people who don't actually have the skills necessary to do a thing. So find a way to get into that middle ground, even if you can't necessarily define the industry. The next question I want to answer for our listeners relates to the importance of storytelling. I like this question a lot. We've gotten something similar to this from probably half a dozen people over the last couple of years on why storytelling is important. One of the things that I did when I got my start in leadership was around storytelling and the importance of storytelling. I think it's an invaluable skill to have as a leader, is the ability to tell stories. But I think it's still just as important today as it was before. That level of necessity from a leadership standpoint to be able to do this is not going away. It's just getting stronger, especially in an era of leading remote teams and having to find ways of connecting with your people. Storytelling is one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that there's such a huge element in the idea of storytelling, and I tend to think about it around like professional leadership testimony is kind of how I frame it, because I think that when you have leaders that are capable of sharing a message and a vision through analogies, through personal experience, through their own mistakes, like that by definition, I think is what we would say is like storytelling. But it's not a story in the fact that it's a fiction story. It's just this ability to grab people's attention, to bring them along on a journey of maybe learning and discovery, and help to say it's not like a great storyteller makes you feel like it's not just about like the thing that you're going through, but that this is a thing that everyone goes through. This is a thing that we've all had to learn, through from a leadership standpoint. They're great at providing you with different ways of thinking about maybe a situation or a problem or an issue. And they're really, really good at considering the language that they use and how they use it. I've had a great, honor of having amazing leaders that were great storytellers over my entire career. And they just pull my attention. They tell me things in such a way that I feel like there's something to learn from that. I want more. I want to go deeper into whatever that analogy was or that example was, or it helps me to reflect on my own kind of learning and growth as a leader. And then I've seen some not great storytellers.
Right.
They're all over the place, and it's hard to figure out like where are we going here and how are we looping this back around to the theme or the thing that we want people to walk away with. So it's been so impactful for me as a leader that I always start any type of strategy or meeting or time that I'm bringing leaders together. I always start with the end in mind. And think about like when they walk away from this, what do I want them to feel and what do I want them to be thinking about? And then how do I tell a story through all of the things that we're going to do to get them there? So I think it's such an important thing that everybody talks about, we say on the surface, but then when you start to ask people like, well, then how do you tell a story? Like how do you do that? That's where it starts to get a little bit shaky for a lot of people, because it takes a lot of thought and purpose to kind of script those things. Over time, you get better at it. You need to do less and less preparation, but initially, to become a great storyteller, you have to take the time to learn how to actually, create, impactful stories.
No, I agree. And, I look at this from a standpoint of like, my kids are in elementary school and they, go through their, reading and English classes. And if you think about, the elements of a good story, the 5 elements of a good story are pretty largely agreed upon in the area of education. And that is character, conflict, plot, setting, and theme. So a good story has all of those things. They have characters, which if you're a leader and you're telling a story, you hopefully you are one of the characters in the story because you're talking about from personal perspective, but there are other people as well. There's a conflict. There's something to overcome. Something happens that you have to overcome because that's where the leadership lesson comes from. There's a plot. So this happened, then this, then this, then this. There's a setting, so you have to kind of bring people back to where you were at the time. How old were you? Where in your career were you? How many years into your career were you? What have you done? What had you done before? The things that kind of set the stage of where you are. And then it has to have a theme. And the theme basically is the kind of the learning from it. What is the purpose of telling this story? What are you trying to impart upon the person that is listening to it? What is that theme? And so a good storyteller understands that their stories have all of those things. And I like what you said about, you become better at it over time. I think the thing that makes you become better at it over time is you just have more things to talk about. Like you have more experience, so you have more stories. But there are a lot of leaders out there who have a ton of experience, but they've never taken the time to put that experience in the format of a story that can be used to, kind of help the next generation of leaders or to help, train or coach or impart a learning on somebody who's having a difficult time. They have those stories. They almost don't know they have them, or they have never kind of figured out how to say them in a way that is impactful. And so they kind of live in their own head, and that's a waste. So if you're a leader, and you don't have this ability or you don't feel comfortable, start looking at some very short stories and what they have in them, and start thinking about things that have happened to you and how you can tell them in a story that is a short anecdote or something that includes character, conflict, plot, setting, and theme, so that you can kind of impart the knowledge onto the people that you're entrusted with leading. I want to go over one more question in this episode before we end, but first I want to go up to word for one of our sponsors. All right, the last question I want to answer on this episode revolves around data and analytics. There are a lot of people out there who are very data driven, they're very analytics driven, and there are a lot of people out there who are, kind of driven by the human aspect of the decision making process. And I think the ways that leaders fail are in only looking at one or the other of those and not taking into account both. And so the question that I kind of want to talk about here that we've gotten from several people is there are people feeling frustrated that decisions seem to be being made by leaders all from a human aspect side of things, without taking into account actual data and analytics, and that can lead to poor outcomes. But they don't want to go the opposite route by having the data and the analytics come in there, and all of a sudden it throws out the human aspect of it too. And that's a very real fear. It can happen in organizations that see the poor outcomes of making decisions from one side or the other, and then because we are natural pendulum swingers as a species, we tend to swing wide the other way instead of getting it right in the middle. And a big failure could be, seeing the failures from only seeing one side of that and then switching all to the other side and losing that first element. I think they're both important.
Yeah, this is one of the places where I'm actually okay with using the word balance.
Yeah,
I think sometimes I challenge that because it's kind of like these things are opposing forces. But and again, I don't think that these things are opposing forces in the act of like the human aspect of decision making and data and analytics. But there is a balance of the two that you need, and whether you call it EQ and IQ or whatever it might be, like there's a piece of this where you need data and analytics. It is the ultimate measurement of the output of what you are doing. Like, are we doing the things to impact an actual outcome at some point? You need to have that information. The human aspect in my mind of that is understanding that there are behaviors and there are approaches that are more likely to get you the data and the analytics that you're looking for, and
Yes.
taking into account that there are many times where the data and the analytics on paper may seem like they are correlated in a positive way, but in reality, they are two sides of the spectrum here, and going, focusing too heavily on one of them will have an impact on the other ones. And the human part of that is understanding where and how do we lean into different aspects of the data and analytics to get the information that we need to help us to build the strategies, versus sometimes what I think we only look at data analytics and then we make assumptions about some of the human aspects of decisions that were made, without spending any time understanding why those decisions were made, or what other factors might have been involved in those decisions. So, I think leaders really, really have to become more comfortable and more competent with both of those things. You have to understand the data and the analytics, because that's going to be the ultimate way of measuring the work that you're doing. But you have to be present and you have to be available to be able to spend time seeing the human aspects of decision making that are happening, that can be discussed and either adjusted, or you can educate people, or you can help to connect the dots between the behavior and the data and the analytics. So it's one of those things where you really have to have both. And as a leader, I think you have to have a balanced approach. In sometimes the balance goes one way. Sometimes you need to lean more into the data analytics when you have people that are making decisions without them. And sometimes you have to lead the other way when all they're doing is looking at the data analytics and they're not using any observable behavior as an input for the strategies that you're trying to implement.
I think where I have tried to find this balance in my life, and where I think a lot of leaders who I really respect as leaders, where they do this too, is the human aspect of the decision making is what drives them. And the data and the analytics are things that they are wholly aware of, and sometimes they use that data and those analytics, and sometimes they throw it out, and instead of letting it own them, and knowing when to be able to do that, as opposed to just putting your head in the sand and saying, I'm going to ignore the data and the analytics because the human aspect of this is so important that it doesn't matter what the data says. That's never a good thing. It does matter what the data says. It does matter what the analytics say. And sometimes the right decision is one that flies in the face of what that data and analytics say, because the cost to the human aspect of the decision is too great to let the data and the analytics control or be the final decision maker on this. But not knowing where, what the data and the analytics are is a great recipe for making a decision based solely on the human aspect that ends up having broader and far more detrimental consequences to the business as a whole, because you went into it not knowing what that data was or what those analytics were. It's the difference between, if you want to invest in stocks, you can read the Yahoo Finance page and you may not know everything that the insiders know, but you'd make a better decision that way than throwing a dart at a dartboard on what to invest in, obviously. Yeah. And so one is, not even knowing what the data and the analytics are is the equivalent of throwing a dart at the dartboard to figure out what to invest in. Having the data and the analytics, is the equivalent of, reading the Yahoo, finance page before making an investment. but making sure that you understand that just because something says something on a bullet point on Yahoo Finance doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be exactly what they say. That there are other elements at play here that are equally, if not more important, and that have to strike a balance. So I think they're both necessary. But again, if you want to be a leader whose people believe that you have their best interests at heart, you need to know how to articulate your decision making in a way that says the human aspect of this decision making process is very, very important to me. As a fiduciary of the organization and as someone in a leadership role who has a responsibility, I can't ignore the data altogether. I have to take into account both.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.